sometimes if I'm going to catch a flight, I actually do use an alarm clock. So hi, I'm Gabriela Hempfling, and I'll be presenting I'll Have What She's Having and Other Models of Behavior. Some background about me. I started my career at NERA Economic Consulting in the securities practice, estimating damages and analyzing claims for use in litigation. This ranged from topics such as the fallout from the financial crisis to product liability to predatory lending. And more recently, I started at Chopt Creative Salad Company in strategy and analytics. And this was my first time going to work with consumers and consumer data. So I really wanted to get a better sense of some of the trends in the industry and some of the anxieties that we're all facing today. Because I'm not only like a data scientist, I'm also a person, a user, and a data point. So I wanted to be a little bit more cognizant about how I was thinking about that. So first, we're going to talk about what some models of customer-consumer behavior would be, and then I'll tie that to some of my experience working with borrower behavior and some of the intertwined history of discrimination there, and also just exploring the Facebook platform, because together with Google, that accounts for 60% of market share for digital ads in the US, so I thought that was a pretty good place to start. And also their website apparently has a lot of good hidden fun facts about some of the trends going on. So by predictive customer behavior modeling, ultimately, I think what organizations are trying to do is segment customers based on their behavior and track them over time, analyzing their purchase behavior in order to understand if this is going to be a lucrative customer going forward, especially relative to the customer acquisition cost. And ultimately, it's designed to make a yes-no decision about whether or not you're going to engage with that customer. This reminded me a lot of models of borrower behavior, where you're using different factors that a borrower presents in a loan application, and that ultimately determines whether or not you think that a borrower is going to repay a loan. Some factors may include credit score, loan to value, debt to income, documentation, and employment history, and ultimately the bank uses those factors to decide whether or not you're eligible for a loan, and if so, what they would charge you for it. Notably absent on this list are race, familial status, and other protected categories. But as going forward, we're becoming more involved with social media, you could use factors outside of these established loan application factors to predict things going forward. Also, banks actually pool these loans together across a variety of factors, which I think makes sense, because if you're relying too much on one concentrated exposure, for example, all coastal people who want beachfront property, or all people who work for the Acme car company, if there's a bad climate event or a bad weather event, or there's sales slump in cars, then this could have a negative impact to their bottom line. And also, if there's only one bank, or if all the banks are using the same model, then customers might be limited in their choice or even awareness of the offers, which is what happened in the history of discrimination and redlining in the mortgage market, where it used to be acceptable to say that specific neighborhoods were considered undesirable or risky, and this led to selective redlining or underinvestment in minority communities, and that had a kind of vicious cyclical effect where the underinvestment also prevented them from appreciating as fast in value. And during the civil rights movement, the government stepped in, and through regulation and the establishment of new agencies, was able to try to combat this with new laws. And then crucially, in 1975, there's also the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which from the CFP website, I just want to read, requires many financial institutions to maintain, report, and publicly disclose loan level information about mortgages. These data help show whether lenders are serving the housing needs of their communities. They give public officials information that helps them make decisions and policies, and they shed light on lending patterns that can be discriminatory. The public data are modified to protect applicant and borrower privacy. And I think this is really important because, and just taking a public example from the NERA package, ham-to data can raise a lot of questions. So in one example, the Boston Fed looked into differences in the rate of denial of loan applications between white and minority borrowers. And further collection showed that for stellar applications, or for certain, part of this result was related to the underlying factors. But for the less than stellar applications, it was actually because when you needed compensating factors, it was the benefit of the doubt was more often given to white borrowers. And because it's such a nuanced and complicated story, I think that's why you continue to see litigation in this field. It's hard to pick apart what's actually an underlying factor and what's actually discriminatory. And the complaint will often state that someone was discriminated against relative to a similarly situated white borrower, which shows that you yourself might not know when you've been discriminated against or targeted until you have a full data set. And I think that you can see in specific categories, and this is just hypothetical, if you're just using one category, FICO score, to predict something, and APR is on the y-axis, then you're looking to see if you've been given a different APR based on your nearest neighbor or somebody who has the exact same factors as you in every other way. And I think a future of personalized experiences could make this especially tricky because you might be different in a lot of different ways, and it will be hard to see if you've been treated unfairly. And I think this relates to the practice of just allowing people to present the facts in an egalitarian fashion. So HUD recently sued Facebook because they had just been allowing advertisers to target based on different factors which were correlated to protected classes, and unfortunately also drawing red lines around specific geographies, which you can see would be problematic. And Facebook developed more of its anti-discriminatory policy and said for housing, employment, and credit, they were actually going to move to a new platform and prevent people from using specific protected classes for targeting, and hopefully that this would help alleviate the problem. But I think this also strikes at the heart of the business model, because if you're reaching people who matter most to you and you're using all these different factors, they could also be correlated with some of those protected classes, and it's actually creating a really complicated environment. And I personally have some personal balance between privacy and personalization that I struggle with, because sometimes I want to give people my data. I don't actually want to get ads that weren't targeted for me, and I actually enjoy when there's some personalized discovery and I find new products that I find relevant. And I think that it's also a better use of resources overall when people aren't being forced to watch ads that they don't like. So it's definitely a balance. But I also don't want to live in a world where I feel like my choices are actually being predetermined for me based on who I am. And I think that as people are targeting people based on who they think that we are like, it could also mean that advertisers are vying for the same users, or that everybody's kind of using the same model and the same information in order to push people towards this or that. And ultimately, it could result in hurting of people or hurting of companies. And both ways, I think when people are too focused and being pushed in one singular direction, you might not think about where you're going. And just digging a little bit more into Facebook's active users. So as of Q1, we had 243 million, there were 243 million active users on Facebook's platform, and that made up about $30 in revenue per user in terms of advertising revenue. And digging in a little bit more, if you just make like a Facebook business profile, you can see some interesting statistics about that. But you see that the audience is about 200 to 250 million, so good, that lines up. Ads clicked on, it's about 16 over 30 days, posts liked 13. And you can see that across America, people like Coca-Cola, that seems to make sense, Pizza Hut, Judicial Watch, Buffalo Wild Wings. And I wanted to look at some audiences that I was a little bit more familiar with, so 26 to 28-year-old New York City men and women. I noticed that the men were clicking on ads fewer times, women were slightly median 350,000 to 400,000. Women were clicking on ads slightly more than the median for the US. And if you target just looking at people who also liked Apple, you can see that 80%, instead of 40%, 80% of those people are using iPhones. And among men, they're clicking on 22 ads now, and women are clicking on 27 ads. And if you think that says something about iPhone users, I tried a lot of different things. Basically, just liking anything means you're more likely to click on ads, which could either be because you're already more engaged on the platform or because maybe they're being better targeted to you. I don't actually know that, and I think that's part of the point. And then I wanted to do some background on this audience because I don't know any of you, or not that many of you. And it's surprise, surprise, you like RStudio and R-bloggers. That wasn't really that helpful. Focusing in on New York City, I got to know that 40% of potentially this audience has a graduate level degree, which probably meant I was never going to impress you with any of my modeling experience. You also like shit academics say, and BAM. And I think this is important because as you kind of get a better sense of who people are and what their behavior is going to be, you can start to think about pushing them in different directions. And just taking a page out of Richard Thaler's book, Nudge, in which he's talking about choice architecture and how you kind of structure a default choice. I struggled to even answer this question. Assume you know how to arrange food in a cafeteria, knowing that you're going to impact how kids eat. So you could either arrange the food to make the kids best off, ostensibly probably making it healthier for them, or choose the food at random because you hate liability, or maybe maximizing sale of items or maximizing profits. But the hardest one was arranging the food to get kids to pick the same choices they would choose themselves. This seems like circular logic because I just told you that like the order of the food matters. So that's a really difficult question to answer. And because it's difficult, I think that's why people or organizations would want to just give the control back to you and say, you know what, like if this stuff is offensive to you, if you don't like this, then you can go in and like manually adjust things the way that you want them to. You can also download your data. But I think if you don't look at your data in the bigger context of how people are targeting you, then you don't necessarily have a good sense of what your data is being used for. And so in conclusion, I think that modeling behavior is really, really difficult, and that wasn't because, and that's not necessarily because I think that modeling is always difficult. You can make a lot of different models, some good or some bad, some better, some worse. But actually just struggling to define the terms as society, what we think is fair, what we think is choice, and what we think is neutral is really difficult. And how much we value privacy versus personalization, that's really difficult. And I don't think that's going to be determined by like a genius in a lab somewhere, but it's actually something that we have to discuss and talk about. And also that impact, not intent matters. So it's not something that you can hide from. It's something that you have to be proactive about. And more data obviously means more scrutiny because the more you know, the more you kind of have a responsibility to act responsibly with that data. And also, I feel like the current environment is very reactive and defensive about these topics, but I think it's actually really cool to talk about because we're all learning more and more about human behavior and uncovering where things have been potentially unfair and how we could potentially make things better. And so just finishing with this, which is a Twitter I never knew about before, but knowledge is power and knowing can be complicated, so kudos to people who are comfortably keeping it complicated. Thank you.